Under the low sun of a late summer evening, the land stretched wide and golden, still breathing with the quiet hum of locusts and the creak of wooden windmills. Dust floated lazily through the warm air, and the scent of hay, sweat, and iron hung thick around the horse ranch that stood near the edge of a forgotten town. It was the kind of place where men came to trade, gamble, and sometimes disappear. The small barn at the back of the property looked no different from the rest, its boards worn, its roof half caved in. But on that evening, it held something far darker than horses or hay. The Apache rode in slow, his horse's hooves stirring faint clouds of dust with each step. His long black hair flowed down his back, glinting under the sun, and his skin bore the marks of the frontier, rough, tanned, and marked by the life of a warrior. Around his neck hung tribal jewelry, simple yet proud, catching bits of sunlight as he moved. He had come down from the hills not for battle but to trade. He sought a strong horse for the long journey ahead, something wild enough to run free, yet tempered enough to trust his command. But as he dismounted, something unsettled him. It wasn't the smell of the animals or the sound of distant voices. It was a faint, broken cry that didn't belong in any barn. He paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the dim interior. Saddles hung from the rafters, ropes coiled along the walls, and shafts of light sliced through gaps in the old boards. Dust danced in the beams like tiny ghosts. He took a cautious step forward, his hand brushing the handle of the knife at his belt. There was movement behind the last stall, soft, trembling. A sound like someone trying not to breathe. He called out in a calm, deep voice, asking if someone was there. No answer came, only the rustle of chains and the low whimper of pain. When he turned the corner, his world shifted. There, against the rough wooden wall, was a woman, her wrists bound in iron cuffs, her dress torn and dirtied, her body bruised from more than labor. Her eyes were wide with fear, and when she looked up, she didn't see a stranger. She saw something between hope and disbelief. The Apache froze, his chest tightening at the sight. He wasn't expecting to find another soul here, least of all one broken and left to die. The barn door creaked as the wind pushed it, and the fading light fell across her face. She flinched at the sound as if expecting someone else to enter, the man who had done this to her perhaps, or those who'd watched and turned away. The Apache stepped closer, slowly, his presence calm but commanding. He reached out not to touch her, but to show she wasn't alone. She pressed her back against the wall, shaking her head, her voice barely a whisper, begging him not to hurt her. He told her he wouldn't. His voice carried the strength of a man used to silence, but his tone was steady, warm, almost protective. Outside, the wind howled faintly through the broken fences, and in the distance a wagon rolled past the road, its wheels echoing like an old memory. Inside the barn, time seemed to stop. The Apache studied the shackles that held her, noticing how deep they had bitten into her wrists. He could see she had been there for days, her lips cracked, her hair tangled with straw and dust. He didn't ask who she was yet. He didn't ask who had done this. There would be time for questions. For now, there was only the sound of his knife sliding free, the faint ring of metal as he began to cut through the iron. When the chain snapped, she gasped, as if remembering what breathing felt like. Her body swayed, weak and trembling. The Apache caught her by the arms, steadying her, his strong hands careful not to hurt her more. For a moment they just stood there, the silence between them heavy with what neither could yet say. She tried to speak, her voice rasping through cracked lips, telling him to leave before they came back. He asked who they were, but she shook her head, too afraid to answer. Her eyes darted to the barn door, as though expecting shadows to move. The Apache looked around and saw signs of struggle, broken planks, dried blood on the ground, a man's hat trampled in the straw. He understood that whatever had happened here wasn't just cruelty. It was a message, the kind that small towns sent to those who didn't belong. He knew it because he had lived it. The woman's face softened when she realized he wasn't like the others. There was something in his expression, quiet strength, maybe mercy, that told her he was not here to trade or to judge. He was a man who had seen pain before and didn't look away from it. She tried to stand, but her legs failed her. He helped her to sit on a bale of hay, his every motion slow and deliberate. The flicker of light from a hanging lantern caught the edge of his features, sharp jawline, steady gaze, a faint scar above his brow. He asked again gently what had happened. Her lips trembled as she tried to explain, the words tumbling out in fragments. Something about being accused, about a man who wanted to claim her, and how no one in town stopped him. She said she had prayed for someone to find her, but never thought it would be an Apache. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth tightening, not in anger, but in understanding. The frontier was full of cruelty, and justice was often twisted by power. He told her softly that she was safe for now. She didn't seem to believe it. Her eyes wandered to the door again, to the outside world that had abandoned her. He turned his head slightly, listening, years of instinct making him alert. Somewhere outside, a distant voice called out, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. The woman's face went pale. She whispered that it was them, the ones who had chained her here. The Apache rose quietly, his muscles tensing, his hand instinctively finding the hilt of his knife. He told her to stay still, his voice barely above a breath. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing closer. The barn door rattled under a heavy hand. Dust fell from the rafters as someone outside cursed about a missing horse. The Apache's eyes locked on the door, and for a moment, everything went still again. The horses quiet, the wind holding its breath, even the woman too frightened to move. He crouched low beside her, his expression unreadable but steady. Her trembling hand reached for his arm, gripping it as if clinging to the only life she had left. He didn't look back, but the warmth of his skin under her fingers told her he wasn't leaving. The footsteps stopped right outside. A shadow fell across the wooden cracks of the barn wall. The Apache's grip tightened on his knife. The woman's heart pounded loud enough for him to hear. Then came the sound of the latch lifting. The Apache's gaze shifted to her, just long enough for her to see something fierce yet calm in his eyes. The look of a man who had made his choice. Outside, the door creaked open, letting in the last light of the evening. What waited on the other side, neither of them knew. But as the first voice shouted into the barn, the Apache took a step forward, placing himself between her and the danger beyond the door. The air was thick with dust and tension, and in that single breath between silence and violence, the story of two strangers, an Apache warrior and a broken woman, began to change the fate of a dying village forever. The door swung open, and a harsh beam of sunlight cut through the dust, falling across the Apache's face. 3 men stood outside, their boots caked with dry mud, their hats low, hands resting on gun belts. They weren't lawmen. You could tell from the way they carried themselves, heavy with arrogance, the kind that came from power without consequence. The tallest one, broad-shouldered and red-faced, squinted into the barn and grunted something about unfinished business. The Apache didn't move. His stillness made them uneasy, though they tried to laugh it off, stepping inside as though they owned the place. The woman drew in a sharp breath, clutching the Apache's arm tighter. Her nails pressed into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He just whispered to her to stay quiet. The men scanned the barn, noticing the broken chain near the wall. One of them cursed under his breath. The leader's smirk faded. "Where's the woman?" he demanded. His eyes landed on the Apache then, realizing this wasn't one of the ranch hands or a passing drifter. "You got no business here, Redskin," he spat, his hand twitching toward his revolver. The Apache said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the kind that comes before thunder. He took one small step forward, just enough to make the man hesitate. The woman's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but her voice was locked somewhere between fear and faith. The leader finally barked a nervous laugh and turned to his men. "Let's show him what happens when savages trespass where they ain't wanted." But before any of them could draw, the Apache moved, swift and controlled. His hand gripped the nearest man's wrist, twisting it with such precision that the revolver dropped before a shot could fire. He didn't kill anyone, only disarmed them, forcing them backward. The men stumbled out of the barn, cursing, promising they'd be back with others. The Apache watched them go, his breath steady, eyes sharp as a hawk's. When silence returned, the woman's knees gave out. She sank to the ground, trembling. The Apache turned to her, his face unreadable but softer now. He told her it was over for the moment, but they would come back. She nodded, her eyes unfocused, tears streaking down her dusty face. He reached for a water canteen hanging by the stall, handed it to her gently. She drank in small sips, her hand shaking so badly the water spilled down her chin. He waited until she found her breath again before asking who those men were. Her voice came slow, fragile as cracked glass. She said the ranch belonged to them, to a man named Briggs, who controlled the land around town. Everyone worked for him or owed him something. Her husband had been a ranch hand here once, loyal and quiet, until he caught Briggs stealing cattle meant for trade. When he spoke up, he was found dead near the creek, his body left to rot in the reeds. The woman had gone to the sheriff, but the sheriff worked for Briggs too. She was dragged from her home that night and brought here, accused of lying and stirring trouble. They said they'd keep her until she learned to keep quiet. The Apache's eyes darkened. He understood the kind of justice that ruled these border towns. Men like Briggs built empires on fear, and no one dared challenge them. The woman lowered her gaze, ashamed of her tears, saying she had prayed every night for mercy, but none came. The Apache said softly that mercy was rare in this land, but strength was not. His words held a quiet truth that made her look up again. There was something in his tone, something solid like the ground after a storm. Outside, the sound of crows broke the calm. The Apache glanced toward the open fields, then back at her. He asked her name. She hesitated, unsure if names even mattered anymore, but she told him anyway. He repeated it once as if committing it to memory. Then he said he would help her leave this place, but she had to move fast. She looked at him, uncertain whether to trust him. She didn't know his name, his tribe, or his story. All she knew was that he had found her when no one else did. As the sun dipped lower, they prepared to leave. The Apache saddled 2 horses quietly, his movements deliberate and calm. The woman tried to stand but winced in pain. Her legs were weak, one ankle swollen and bruised. He helped her up, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, placing her gently on the horse. She looked around the barn one last time, her eyes lingering on the broken chains that had held her captive. The Apache climbed onto his own horse and led the way out through the back trail, avoiding the main road. The land stretched wide before them, endless and raw. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust. They rode in silence for a long while until the barn disappeared behind the hills. The woman broke the quiet, asking where he was taking her. He said there was a safe place, a small camp deep in the canyons where no one from town would dare follow. She didn't ask how he knew the land so well. It was clear this wilderness had once been his home. As they rode, she began to notice things about him. The way he always scanned the horizon, how he could tell direction by the wind, how he rode with silent confidence. His skin bore small scars, not from pride but survival. His eyes, though fierce, carried the weight of old grief. She realized he was not just a man of strength, but one marked by loss too. Night fell as they reached the canyon. The Apache built a small fire, careful to keep the flames low. The woman sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a tin cup he had filled with warm water. The light flickered across his face, revealing a man carved by time and silence. She asked him quietly why he had come to the barn that day. He told her he had been passing through, looking to trade for a horse before heading south to his people. But fate, he said, had another plan. She smiled faintly for the first time, though her eyes were still tired. "You don't even know me," she whispered. He met her gaze and said, "I didn't need to. I saw what they did. That was enough." His words lingered in the night air, simple yet heavy with meaning. As the fire crackled, she began to tell him more. About the town of Red Hollow, once small and peaceful until Briggs came. About how he had bought up every piece of land, driving out those who resisted. About how the local law turned its back while good men disappeared. Her story unfolded slowly, like pages of a book no one dared to read aloud. The Apache listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as she spoke. When she was done, he looked into the flames for a long while before saying, "A town built on fear can't stand forever." The woman didn't know whether he meant it as comfort or warning. Either way, it stayed with her. The night grew colder, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The Apache rose quietly, checking the perimeter of their small camp. His instincts told him danger wasn't far. Briggs wouldn't let humiliation go unanswered. Somewhere out there, men were likely saddling horses, loading rifles, and following their trail. He returned to the fire, his expression calm but alert. The woman asked if he thought they'd find them. He nodded once. "They'll try." His tone carried no fear, only certainty. She wanted to ask what he planned to do when they did, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered a thank you, a fragile word in a hard world. He only nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where dawn would soon rise. Hours passed in silence. The fire dimmed. The woman drifted into uneasy sleep, her head resting against the saddle near the fire. The Apache remained awake, every sound stirring his senses. The rustle of wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the faint crack of a branch somewhere in the dark. He reached for the knife at his side, his fingers brushing the cold steel. He had seen too many nights like this, where the quiet before danger felt almost peaceful. When the first light touched the canyon walls, painting them in shades of amber and rose, he stood and looked toward the trail. There were faint tracks in the dust, fresh, too many for just a few horses. He knew they had been followed. He turned toward the woman, still asleep by the dying fire, her face softer in the morning light. For a moment he hesitated. He had no reason to protect her beyond what was right, yet something deeper was pulling him. Something he couldn't name. The wind shifted, carrying voices faint, but growing. The Apache reached for his horse's reins and gently woke her. She stirred, confused, until she saw his expression and understood. Fear returned to her eyes. He told her they had to move now. She nodded, quickly gathering what little they had. As they mounted their horses, the sound of approaching riders echoed through the canyon. The Apache looked once more toward the rising sun, his face calm, his resolve unshaken. The woman, though terrified, felt something different this time. Not helplessness, but trust. Together they turned toward the narrow pass leading deeper into the wild. The first gunshot cracked through the air behind them, echoing off the canyon walls. And the chase began. And as dust rose around their fleeing horses, one thing became clear. The Apache hadn't just stumbled into that barn by chance. Fate had drawn him into a battle that would change not only the life of a beaten woman, but the soul of a town that had long forgotten what justice meant. The thunder of hooves echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the red cliffs like rolling drums. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds as the Apache urged the horses deeper into the narrow pass. The woman clung to the reins, her hair whipping in the wind, fear coursing through every nerve. Behind them, the riders drew closer, their angry shouts carried by the wind, their silhouettes cutting against the golden light. The Apache glanced back, his eyes sharp, calculating the terrain. He knew this land well. It was his kind of country, hard, unforgiving, and full of places to vanish if one knew where to look. The canyon narrowed ahead, the path splitting in two. He guided his horse toward the left trail where the rocks grew jagged and uneven. The woman followed, struggling to stay steady. The horses thundered through the rough terrain until the sound of pursuit began to fade. Only then did he slow to a halt beneath a cluster of mesquite trees. The woman's breath came in shallow bursts, her hands trembling on the reins. He turned toward her and listened for a moment. No voices, no hooves. Just wind and silence. They'll regroup, he said quietly. We bought time, not safety. She nodded, still trying to catch her breath. They won't stop, she whispered. Not until I'm dead, or back in those chains. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then we make sure neither happens. As dusk settled, they made camp beneath the canyon wall. The Apache gathered dry brush and started a small fire, shielding it with stones. The woman sat close, arms wrapped around herself. The flames threw warm light across her face, revealing exhaustion and something else. Confusion. She didn't understand why this man, a stranger, risked his life for her. She asked him softly why he didn't just leave her behind when the gunfire started. He didn't look up. I've seen too many people walk away, he said. I'm not one of them. There was truth in his tone, a deep weariness that spoke of old wounds. The woman studied him quietly. She realized he carried his own ghosts, though he said nothing about them. The way he kept glancing toward the stars, the careful silence between his breaths, it was the kind of quiet that came from losing more than words could ever tell. As the fire burned low, she began to share more of her story, her husband's death, the townsfolk who turned their backs, the way Briggs had twisted the town's law to serve himself. She told him how Briggs's men took what they wanted, land, cattle, even people, and no one dared stand against them. The Apache listened without interrupting, his jaw set. When she finished, the canyon went silent again, the crackle of fire filling the air. Why doesn't anyone stop him? He finally asked. They tried, she said. But the sheriff's his cousin. The preacher owes him money and the townspeople fear losing what little they have left. Briggs feeds on that fear. It's his weapon. The Apache nodded slowly. Fear makes good chains, he said. Harder to break than iron. Later that night, when she had fallen asleep by the fire, he walked a few steps away and knelt by the rocks. His hand brushed the ground, feeling the faint vibration of distant riders. He knew Briggs wouldn't quit. Men like that didn't forgive humiliation. They'd come not just for her, but for him too. He looked out across the dark canyon, remembering his people's own battles with settlers, the broken treaties, the burned camps. He had seen greed destroy everything sacred. And now here it was again. Different faces, same evil. By morning, they rode toward a small outpost known as Widow's Creek, a place where traders and drifters came to rest. The Apache thought they could find food and maybe news there. The woman pulled her shawl low to hide her face. She couldn't risk being recognized. The outpost was quiet, just a few wagons, a blacksmith hammering metal, and a saloon that smelled of dust and whiskey. The Apache told her to wait behind the barn while he went inside. Inside, the saloon was dim and filled with smoke. A few men played cards near the window. The Apache ordered water, not whiskey, which drew curious stares. The barkeep, a tired-looking man with gray whiskers, leaned closer. "Not many of your kind ride this way," he muttered. "I don't plan to stay," the Apache replied. "Just passing through." The barkeep eyed him carefully. "Then you best move quick. Word's out. Briggs put a price on your head. Says you kidnapped one of his women." The Apache's gaze didn't waver. "That woman was a prisoner," he said quietly. "You know it." The barkeep hesitated, lowering his voice. "I know what Briggs is, but that don't matter around here. He owns every gun from here to Red Hollow. If you're smart, you'll keep riding south before nightfall." The Apache nodded, leaving a coin on the counter before stepping outside. He found the woman waiting, anxiety etched on her face. When she saw his expression, she knew. "He's spreading lies already, isn't he?" she said. "Yes," he replied, "and lies travel faster than truth." They left the outpost quickly, following a river trail east. Along the way, she spoke of her husband's old friend, a farmer who lived near the edge of Red Hollow. "He might help us," she said. He was one of the few who ever stood up to Briggs. The Apache agreed to go there, though he warned her that going closer to town meant more danger. The farmer's land sat on the border of the prairie, surrounded by dry cornstalks and a fence that looked more symbolic than useful. The man, old and lean with tired eyes, opened the door when they arrived. For a moment he didn't recognize her. Then his face went pale. "Lord above," he whispered. "They said you were dead." She smiled faintly. "Not yet." He looked at the Apache warily but welcomed them inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and old earth. As they ate, the woman told him everything: her capture, her rescue, the chase. The old man listened, shaking his head. "Briggs won't stop," he said finally. "He's got too much pride, and now that an Apache's involved, he'll call it vengeance instead of cruelty. Folks will believe him." The Apache looked up from his meal. "Then let him come. I don't hide from cowards." The old man studied him for a long moment. "You've got fire in you, son, but this town, it burns everyone who tries to stand tall. They'll hunt you both till one of you falls." The woman reached for the Apache's arm as if to calm him. "We'll find a way," she said softly. That night, as they rested in the barn, the Apache couldn't sleep. He sat near the door, watching the moonlight pour through the cracks in the wood. He could feel the storm brewing. Briggs wouldn't wait long. He'd rally his men, spin his lies, and turn the whole town against them. The woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring words he couldn't quite hear. He looked at her, wondering how someone so broken could still find hope. Before dawn, distant thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from horses. The Apache's instincts flared. He shook the woman awake and helped her up. "They found us," he said. The old farmer stumbled out of the house, rifle in hand. Through the fog, dark figures emerged along the ridge, riders carrying torches, their shouts echoing across the plains. The Apache led the woman toward the back of the barn, saddling their horses with speed. The old man raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "I'll hold them off," he said. The Apache looked at him, saw the determination in his eyes, and nodded once in respect. As he and the woman galloped away, the sound of gunfire cracked through the dawn. They didn't look back. The wind whipped through their hair, and the prairie opened wide before them. The woman clung tighter, fear and grief mixing in her chest. She didn't know if the old man survived, but she knew he had given them one more chance. The Apache's jaw tightened as he scanned the horizon. There was no going back now, not to the canyon, not to peace. The fight had found them, and it would follow until one side broke. He thought of Briggs, of the men who called themselves righteous while living off cruelty. He thought of the woman beside him, whose courage had begun to outshine her fear. Ahead, the land rose into shadowed hills where the sun struggled to break through. The Apache guided the horses toward it, knowing that beyond those hills lay something greater than escape: truth, reckoning, and a storm no man could run from. The woman looked back once, seeing the torches far behind them flickering like dying stars, and whispered a silent prayer. Neither of them knew what awaited them in Red Hollow, but both understood something now. This was no longer about running. It was about returning, to face the fire that had started long before they met in that forgotten barn. The sun hung low behind the hills when they reached the outskirts of Red Hollow. The air felt heavy, filled with dust and the low hum of crickets, and the faint outline of the town shimmered through the heat haze. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of a hammer striking iron carried from the blacksmith's shop. It should have been peaceful, Yet nothing about the silence felt right. The Apache reined in his horse on a ridge overlooking the main road. He scanned the valley below, his eyes narrowing as he spotted armed riders posted along the fences. Briggs had already filled the town with fear. What had once been a quiet farming settlement now looked like a fortress. The woman sat beside him, her face pale under the fading light. She recognized some of the men patrolling the road, neighbors, ranch hands, even the town preacher's son. They weren't outlaws, just ordinary people doing what they were told. That was how Briggs worked. He didn't rule with strength alone. He ruled with fear disguised as loyalty. She looked at the Apache, her voice low. "If we go down there, they'll kill you on sight. And they'll drag me back." He didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the water tower that rose in the center of town, near the saloon and the sheriff's office. He could tell everything revolved around that spot. The same place Briggs held his meetings, the same place he probably told his lies. "They already tried to kill us," he said quietly. "Now it's time they face the truth." They rode down slowly, staying to the shadows of the tree line until the sky dimmed to twilight. The air smelled of gunpowder and smoke, faint traces of a warning. The woman's heart pounded as they approached the back road that led into the old part of town. Every wooden fence, every flicker of lantern light, brought back memories she wished she could forget. Her husband's laughter in their old home, the night the sheriff's men came for her, the way the townsfolk closed their doors when she screamed. Now she was returning to the same place, but not the same woman. The Apache stopped his horse behind a small abandoned barn near the creek that ran past the mill. He dismounted and helped her down gently. The town glowed faintly in the distance, voices echoing faintly through the evening air. He told her to stay hidden while he went ahead to scout the streets. She shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "No, if this is the end, I need to see it too." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close." They moved through the narrow alleys like shadows, their footsteps soft against the dirt. The Apache's senses were sharp. Every sound, the creak of a shutter, the bark of a dog, the rattle of a chain, kept him alert. The woman stayed behind him, clutching the small knife he had given her. When they reached the main street, the scene before them was worse than either expected. Lanterns burned outside the saloon and along the porch of the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered, men, women, even children, all drawn by the spectacle at the center of town. Briggs stood on the wooden platform beside the sheriff, his voice carrying over the restless crowd. "An Apache savage and a deceitful woman," he declared, waving a folded paper high in the air. "They've brought shame to this land, burned our barns, and murdered decent men. We'll make an example of them before dawn." The woman's stomach twisted at his words. She knew those people. She'd shared meals with them, helped deliver their children, prayed beside them on Sundays. Yet now their faces looked blank, dulled by fear and persuasion. Briggs had turned her into a symbol, a story to keep his control intact. The Apache's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Briggs. The man stood tall, wearing a fine coat and a silver belt buckle that caught the lantern light. He was the image of power and pride. Around him, armed men waited like wolves ready to pounce. The Apache whispered for her to stay hidden as he stepped back into the shadows. His mind worked fast. He needed to draw them out, create chaos, and give her a chance to escape if things went wrong. He scanned the rooftops, noting the positions of the guards. Every exit was covered, but he noticed something. The old mill near the creek still had its back door unbarred. If they could reach it, they might find a way to the outer road. He turned to tell her, but she was staring straight ahead, frozen. Her old home stood just across the street from the sheriff's office. The windows were boarded now, the porch sagging, but she could still see the marks where her husband had carved their initials on the beam. For a moment her breath caught. She stepped forward, forgetting the danger, and the sound of her boot scraping on a loose board echoed faintly. The Apache grabbed her arm and pulled her back just as a lantern light swung toward them. Voices rose. "Someone's by the barn!" Within seconds, chaos erupted. Men shouted. Guns were cocked and footsteps thundered down the street. The Apache pushed her behind the barrels and ducked low. A gunshot split the air, splintering the wood near his head. The woman screamed but covered her mouth quickly. The Apache drew his knife, eyes darting for an opening. He could hear Briggs shouting orders, his voice full of triumph. "They're here! Search every corner! The savage dies tonight!" The Apache motioned for her to move toward the back alley. They ran, staying close to the shadows as bullets tore through the night air. The woman stumbled, her foot catching on a broken plank, but he caught her before she fell. They reached the edge of the alley when a man appeared out of nowhere, blocking their path. His revolver gleamed under the lantern light. Before he could fire, the Apache lunged, striking his arm and sending the gun flying into the dirt. The two men struggled fiercely, the sounds of fists and boots echoing off the walls. The woman froze, torn between fear and instinct. But when she saw the Apache falter under the attacker's weight, she grabbed the fallen revolver and fired into the air. The sound cracked like thunder, sending nearby men running toward them. The Apache used the distraction to throw his opponent off balance and knocked him unconscious. He grabbed her hand. "Run!" he said. They bolted toward the mill, the night alive with gunfire and shouting. The town was awake now, lights flaring in every window, dogs barking wildly. The woman's lungs burned, her heart pounding with each desperate step. She could hear Briggs's voice somewhere behind them, furious and determined. "Don't let them get away! I want their heads!" They reached the mill and slipped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of old grain and oil. The Apache barred the door and listened. Outside, the sound of boots grew closer. He looked up at the rafters, then at the large wooden wheel near the wall. "We can climb," he said. "Get to the roof." The woman hesitated, her body trembling from exhaustion. "I can't," she whispered. He caught her chin gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You can. You survived worse than this." Something in his tone steadied her. She nodded and began to climb, following him up the old beams. The structure creaked under their weight. Below them, shadows moved past the door, lantern light flickering across the floorboards. Voices echoed. "Search inside! They're trapped!" From the roof, they could see the entire town glowing under the torchlight. The people of Red Hollow had gathered again, drawn by the noise, unsure of what they were witnessing anymore. The Apache crouched near the edge, scanning for a way out. The back road was blocked. The river to the east shimmered faintly under the moonlight. It was their only chance. He turned to the woman. "We'll jump from the back wall into the river. It's deep enough to carry us out of town." She stared at him, terrified. "We'll die." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Not tonight." Before they could move, the roof shuddered. A bullet tore through one of the beams, then another. The Apache shielded her as splinters rained down. Shouts rose from below. They were surrounded. Briggs himself stepped into the milliard, his voice booming with confidence. "You can't run forever. Come down now, and maybe I'll let her live." The Apache looked down at him, his expression unreadable. The woman's breath came in ragged gasps. She could see Briggs's face clearly now, smug, cruel, certain he had already won. The Apache's hand found hers, steady and warm. "When I say jump," he whispered, "don't look back." The night grew still again, that haunting kind of silence that comes before everything breaks loose. The torches below flickered against the walls, painting shadows like flames. The woman's fingers tightened around his. He gave a single nod, his eyes never leaving the men below. Then, with the echo of thunder in the distance, and the sound of the river rushing beneath, the Apache stepped toward the edge of the roof, his figure dark against the firelight, as the world below erupted in chaos once more. The wind screamed through the mill roof as the Apache gripped her hand tighter. Lantern light flashed below where Briggs's men shouted orders, rifles glinting in the glow. The woman's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She didn't know if she would live another minute, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The Apache looked back once, his long black hair whipping across his face, his dark eyes steady. Then, without another word, he pulled her close and leapt from the roof. The fall seemed endless. The roar of the river swallowed the world, and the freezing water hit like stone. She felt herself dragged under, her lungs burning as darkness pulled at her. Strong arms wrapped around her, holding her up, pulling her toward the surface. They broke through into the cold night air, gasping, clinging to each other as the current swept them downstream. Gunfire echoed faintly behind them, fading with every turn of the river. By the time they reached the quiet bend past the cliffs, the moon had risen high. The Apache guided them to the bank, pulling her gently onto the sand. Both were soaked, trembling, breathless. The woman lay still for a moment, staring at the sky. The stars seemed brighter than ever, and for the first time in years, she felt the air fill her lungs without pain. The Apache stood nearby, scanning the dark tree line. His instincts never rested, not even now. "Did we lose them?" she asked softly, her voice raw. "For now," he said. "But Briggs isn't the kind to give up." She sat up slowly, her body aching. Then what happens next? He looked down the river, his face unreadable. You decide, he said. You can keep running, or we go back and finish this. The idea of returning to Red Hollow made her heart twist. She had spent months praying to escape, to vanish, to forget. But now she realized there would be no peace unless Briggs was stopped. The Apache seemed to read her thoughts. He crouched in front of her, his voice calm but firm. He took your home, your name, your voice. If you don't take them back, he'll keep doing it to others. The woman stared at him, the flickering moonlight catching the exhaustion in her eyes. You'd fight for me? I'd fight for what's right, he replied, even if the world stands against it. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the river whispering beside them. Then she nodded. Then we go back. They rested until dawn, gathering their strength. When morning came, they followed an old trail that wound through the canyon, hidden from sight. The Apache moved with purpose, his every motion deliberate. He knew Briggs's kind, men who believed power was eternal until someone stripped it away. The woman followed close, her steps still unsteady, but her resolve hardening with each mile. By midday, the town appeared again on the horizon, smaller now under the wide blue sky. The streets were quiet, but smoke still rose from the saloon. They stopped on a ridge overlooking Red Hollow. The Apache studied the movement of men around the sheriff's office. He pointed to the corral beside it. That's where they'll keep the horses. If we cut them loose, the noise will scatter the guards. You go to the old church. Wait there. I'll find Briggs. The woman hesitated. And if you don't come back? He looked at her, his eyes steady. Then do what I can't. Tell them the truth. When they separated, the air seemed to hold its breath. The Apache moved like a shadow through the edge of town, slipping behind fences and stacks of lumber. Every step was quiet, every corner measured. He saw the guards by the corral, two men with rifles leaning against the gate, laughing like fools who thought the world owed them safety. He waited for the wind to rise, then moved in. Within seconds, both men lay silent, the horses snorting nervously in their stalls. He opened the gate and slapped the nearest flank. The herd bolted into the street, kicking up dust and confusion. Shouts rang out across Red Hollow. The sheriff stumbled from his office, yelling for order. The townspeople spilled into the street, startled and shouting. Amid the chaos, the Apache made his way toward the saloon. He found Briggs inside, seated, at his table with a drink in hand, surrounded by a few of his men. The man didn't even flinch when the Apache stepped through the doorway. I knew you'd crawl back, Briggs sneered. Savages always do. The Apache stood in the doorway, calm as stone. You've taken enough, he said. It ends today. Briggs laughed and rose from his chair. You think these people will believe you? I built this town. I feed them. I protect them. You're nothing but a ghost in their eyes. The Apache took a slow step forward. Then let them see what kind of man you really are. Outside, the woman had reached the church. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the dusty stillness. Shafts of light cut through the broken windows, falling on the empty pews. She knelt at the front, whispering a prayer not for herself, but for him. Then, from outside, she heard the crowd's noise change, from chaos to silence. She rushed to the doorway. Briggs had stepped out of the saloon, revolver drawn, his voice booming across the square. You want to see justice? I'll show you. Justice! He fired into the air, and the sound sent everyone ducking for cover. The Apache stood motionless in the center of the street, the dust swirling around him. The woman froze in the church doorway, her heart in her throat. Run! She shouted, but he didn't move. Briggs raised his gun again, but before he could fire, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. He's telling the truth! It was the old blacksmith, the one who'd seen too much and stayed quiet too long. Then another voice joined, and another. People began stepping out from their doorways, eyes turning from fear to anger. The sheriff hesitated, looking around as the crowd grew restless. Briggs spun on them, shouting to regain control, but his words faltered. The lie that had held the town together was unraveling before everyone's eyes. The Apache took a slow step forward, his voice steady. You used fear to build your power. Now you'll watch it break. Briggs turned his gun on him, rage twisting his face. You think you can take this from me? The shot rang out. For a moment, time froze. Dust rose from the ground, the echo rolling off the walls. When it cleared, Briggs was on his knees, staring in disbelief at the revolver that had fallen from his hand. The sheriff had lowered his own gun, smoke curling from the barrel. "It's over," the sheriff said quietly, his voice hollow. Briggs fell forward, the weight of his sins heavy in the dust. The crowd stayed silent. The Apache didn't move. He simply looked down at the man who had broken so many lives and then turned toward the woman. She stood in the church doorway, tears in her eyes, relief and sorrow mingled together. Days later, the town began to change. The sheriff stepped down. The people rebuilt what fear had destroyed. The woman reclaimed her home near the river, though the memories still haunted the walls. The Apache stayed for a while, helping mend fences and repair barns. But he never lingered long. One morning, she found him saddling his horse. "You're leaving," she said softly. He nodded. "There are other towns like this. Other fights." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Then promise me you'll come back." He looked at her for a long moment, the hint of a smile touching his face. "If the wind leads me here again," he said. She watched him ride away across the open land, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared into the horizon. The sky was vast and golden, the air still carrying the scent of the river and dust. For the first time, Red Hollow felt alive again. Years later, folks would still tell the story, the tale of an Apache who rode into a town of fear and changed it forever, not with vengeance, but with courage. They said he came for a horse and found a broken woman instead, and together they reminded a whole town what freedom really meant. And though his name was never carved on any stone, the wind through the canyon still carried his memory, quiet, strong, and unforgotten.